Sold the diner already, didn't you? My sister's words landed flat across the conference room, and for a second, nobody at the long table said anything at all. The lawyer stopped shuffling his papers. My brother-in-law looked down at his coffee. And my mother, sitting at the far end with her hands folded like she was waiting for grace before a meal, finally raised her eyes to look at me for the first time in 3 years. I didn't answer. I just sat there with my hands in my lap, the way I'd learned to sit through 1,000 things worse than this. The estate attorney cleared his throat and glanced at me over his reading glasses, and that was when he asked the question that turned the whole room upside down. "Before we continue," he said slowly, "does anyone here actually know what your sister does for a living?" The room went quiet in a way I hadn't heard since the funeral. My sister's mouth opened and closed. My mother blinked, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not satisfaction, just a strange stillness, like the moment right before a storm finally breaks and you realize you've been holding your breath the whole time. But that question didn't come out of nowhere. To understand why a room full of my own family went silent, you have to go back about a month. To the morning I drove back into a town I swore I'd never set foot in again. I hadn't been back to Millbrook, Indiana in almost 7 years. It's the kind of place where the water tower still has the high school mascot painted on it, and the same families have owned the same storefronts on Main Street since before I was born. I grew up there. I left there. And for a long time I told myself those were the 2 most honest sentences I knew. The drive-in from the interstate took me past the grain elevator, past the Methodist church with the crooked steeple, past the Casey's gas station, where I used to buy fountain cokes on summer nights. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. Small towns do that. They stay exactly the same while you change completely, and then you come back and feel like a stranger walking through your own memory. I pulled into the lot behind Hartley's Diner a little after 8 in the morning. The neon sign in the window was the same one my grandfather had hung in 1974, a coffee cup with steam curling up out of it, half the tubes burned out so it always looked like the steam was missing a piece. I sat in my truck for a while, with the engine off just looking at it. I'd worked behind that counter every summer from the time I was 13. My grandmother taught me how to crack an egg with one hand at that griddle. When I finally walked in, the bell over the door rang the same way it always had, and every head at the counter turned. There was a woman behind the register I didn't recognize at first, and then I did. Donna, who used to waitress the breakfast shift when I was a kid. She'd gotten older the way we all do without noticing. She squinted at me, and I watched her run my face through whatever filing system she kept in her head. "Well, I'll be damned," she said softly. "Rebecca Hartley?" "Morning, Donna." "Honey, we figured you fell off the face of the earth." She came around the counter and poured me a coffee before I even sat down. "Black, no sugar," she remembered. In a town like Millbrook, they remember what you drink before they remember your phone number. "You here for your granddad?" I wrapped both hands around the mug. The coffee tasted exactly like it did when I was 16 and exhausted and dreaming about anywhere but here. "Something like that," I said. The truth was more complicated than that, like most truths are. My grandfather had passed away 9 days earlier. A heart attack in his sleep, the doctor said. Quick. He was 83 and he'd been running that diner 6 mornings a week right up until the end, flipping pancakes for men who'd been coming in since the Carter administration. I got the call from Pastor Lindgren, the same man who'd baptized me when I was a baby. He found me through an old church directory and a lot of patience. When I heard his voice on the phone, I knew before he said a single word. "You always know." What I didn't know yet was that my grandfather had left me the diner. The whole thing, the building, the recipes, the land it sat on, everything. I found that out the same way the rest of my family did, which was part of the problem. I hadn't spoken to my mother or my sister in 3 years. Not since the last Thanksgiving I tried to come home, the one that ended with my mother telling me I'd thrown my life away and my sister nodding along beside her like a backup singer who knew all the words. I'd left before dessert, drove 4 hours back to the city in the dark and didn't look back. For a long time, the silence between us felt like the most peaceful thing I owned. My grandfather was the one person who never made me feel like I had to explain myself. He used to say, "Becca, you don't owe anybody an itinerary. He'd write me letters in his shaky handwriting, the kind nobody writes anymore, and slip a 20 in for gas money, even when I told him I was fine. He was the only one who ever asked me what I actually did, instead of telling me what I should be doing. So when the reading of the will got scheduled, I drove back. Not for the diner. For him. I should have known my sister would already be there. Her name is Caroline. She's 2 years older than me, and she still lives in Millbrook, in a nice house on the good side of town with a husband named Greg, who sells insurance and a lawn he treats like it's an extension of his personality. Caroline did everything right by the town's measure. Married young, stayed close, went to church, raised 2 kids who call my mother every Sunday. And for most of my life, that contrast was the whole story of our family. The daughter who stayed and the daughter who ran. The afternoon I got into town, before I'd even unpacked, Caroline showed up at the little motel out on Route 9 where I was staying. She must have heard from somebody that my truck was in town. News travels faster than facts in Millbrook. She knocked on the door and I opened it, and we stood there looking at each other for a second like 2 people who used to know the same language. "You came back for the money," she said. "No hello. Nothing." "I came back because Granddad died, Caroline." "Right." She crossed her arms. "Funny how that lines up with the will." I kept my voice level. "I didn't even know about the will until the lawyer called." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You disappear for years. You don't call Mom. You don't come to Christmas. And the minute there's something to inherit, you're back in town in that ridiculous truck." She shook her head. "Greg and I are the ones who took care of Granddad. We're the ones who drove him to his doctor's appointments. Where were you?" I didn't have a good answer for that. Not one she'd accept. The truth was, I sent my grandfather money every month and called him on Sunday nights, and that he asked me not to tell anyone because he said it would just start a fight. But standing in a motel doorway with my sister, I knew none of that would land. So I said the only thing I knew was true. I loved him too. She looked at me for a long moment, and for just a second I thought I saw something underneath the anger. Something tired and sad. Then it was gone. "We're contesting it," she said. "Greg already talked to a lawyer. You're not just gonna waltz in here and take a piece of this family that you walked out on." She left without saying goodbye. I watched her taillights disappear down Route 9, and I sat on the edge of that motel bed for a long time, listening to the highway, wondering how it was possible to feel homesick for a place that didn't want you. The reading was set for the following week. 7 days is a long time to wait for something you're dreading. I spent most of it at the diner, which had been closed since my grandfather died, sitting in the dim quiet and not knowing what to do with myself. I cleaned, mostly. It gave my hands something to do. I scrubbed the griddle the way my grandmother had taught me. I wiped down the booths and found a pencil behind one of the cushions that had Hartley's Diner stamped on the side, the ones my grandfather used to order by the gross. I sat in his office in the back, a closet really, and went through his books. He kept everything by hand. Columns of numbers and that shaky writing, every cup of coffee accounted for. People stopped by, not to help, to look. To see if the rumors were true, that the Hartley girl was back. Old Mr. Haupt. Peterson, who'd had the same booth by the window for 30 years, rapped on the glass one morning and I let him in and made him a cup of coffee, and he told me my grandfather used to brag about me. I didn't believe him at first. "He kept a clipping," Peterson said, settling onto his stool like he'd never left it, carried it in his wallet, showed half the town. I didn't ask what clipping. I didn't want to cry in front of a man I barely knew. A few days before the reading, I met Caroline's lawyer outside the courthouse, where I'd gone to pick up some paperwork about the estate. His name was Bill Castellano, and he was exactly what you picture. Good suit, firm handshake, the easy confidence of a man who's won most of his fights in a town small enough to know everyone in it. "Ms. Hartley," he said, like we were old friends, "I represent your sister and her husband." I figured. "I'm sure you understand their position. Your grandfather was elderly. He'd been alone since your grandmother passed. People in that situation are vulnerable. It's not unreasonable to ask whether the will reflects his true intentions or whether someone, influenced him during a difficult time." I almost laughed at that. The idea that I'd influenced anyone, having not set foot in town in 7 years. "He wrote that will 3 years ago," I said. "It's notarized. I have a copy." Castellano smiled, didn't move. "Wills can be challenged, and challenges can be expensive for everyone." He let that hang there. It would be a lot simpler if you signed your interest over to your sister. Keep it in the family. Avoid the legal fees. Avoid the spectacle. He glanced toward Main Street, toward the diner. A place like that, it's a lot to maintain. A young woman with a career somewhere else. What would you even do with it? There it was. The thing my whole family had always assumed about me. That my life out there was small. That I'd come back and take the money and run, because that's what disappointments do. I'll be at the reading, I said. His smile tightened, just slightly. Suit yourself. That night I sat in my grandfather's office and read the will again. It was simple, like he was. The diner and the land to me. A sum of money split between Caroline's kids for college. His old truck to Greg, which was a kinder gesture than Greg deserved. And clipped to the back page, not part of the legal document at all, just folded into it, was a note in his handwriting. Becca, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry I'm not there to tell you in person. I left you the diner because you're the only one who ever understood what it was. Your sister sees a building. You see what your grandmother and I built with our hands. Don't let anybody make you feel small for the size of your dreams. You always were the bravest one. Love, Granddad. I read it about a dozen times. Then I folded it up and put it in my pocket, and I knew I wasn't going to sign anything. The morning of the reading, it rained. One of those gray Indiana drizzles that doesn't commit to anything. The estate attorney, a man named Howard Finch, who'd handled half the wills in the county, had us all meet in a conference room above the bank on Main Street. My grandfather had hired him decades ago, and I got the sense Finch had liked the old man. I got there early. Caroline and Greg came in a few minutes later with Castellano, the three of them moving like a unit. My mother came last alone, and the sight of her stopped me cold. She'd gotten older. 3 years older than the last time, but it looked like 10. She didn't say anything to me. She sat at the far end of the table, as far from me as the room allowed, and folded her hands and waited. Finch went through the preliminaries. Then Castellano started in. And he was good. I'll give him that. He talked about my grandfather's age, his loneliness, his decline. He talked about Caroline and Greg's years of devotion, the doctor's appointments, the meals dropped off. He talked about how a man in his final years might be swayed by a grieving granddaughter who'd suddenly reappeared. He never quite called me a manipulator. He just built a little house around the idea and invited everyone to live in it. And then my mother spoke. She didn't ask permission. She just started talking, her voice thin and shaking. I raised both of them the same, she said. I gave that girl everything, and she left. She didn't call. She didn't come home when her own grandmother got sick. She stayed gone for years, and now she wants to take the one thing that was supposed to stay in this family. Her eyes finally came up and found mine across the table. She was always selfish. Even as a child, she only ever thought about herself. The room was quiet. Caroline was nodding. Greg was studying his hands. And then my mother said it. The sentence I think she'd been carrying for years, looking for a place to set it down. She's nothing but a selfish, ungrateful girl who only comes around when there's something in it for her. The words just sat there. Nobody moved. I heard the rain against the window and the hum of the fluorescent lights and somebody's chair creak. I didn't say anything. I'd learned a long time ago that you can't win an argument that's really about somebody's fear. And my mother had been afraid of me, of what I represented, for most of my life. Howard Finch had been quiet through all of it, watching, his pen still. He set it down now. He looked at Castellano, then at my mother, and then he asked the question that broke the room open. Before we go any further, he said, I have to ask, does your family actually know what Rebecca does for a living? Castellano blinked. She works somewhere out of state, I believe. We weren't able to. That's not what I asked, Finch said. Caroline frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Finch picked up a document from the folder in front of him, the one I'd submitted along with my copy of the will. He tapped it once. Counsel, he said to Castellano, before you stand up and tell a room that a person is selfish, it's usually wise to know who that person actually is. He turned the page around so Castellano could read it. I knew which one it was. It was the letter from the hospital system in Chicago. Castellano leaned forward and I watched his face change. Just a little, but enough. I wasn't aware, he said quietly. That's clear, said Finch. My mother's voice came out sharp. Aware of what? What is this? Finch didn't look at her right away. He looked at the room, the way you do when you're about to say something you want people to remember. Then he said it plainly. Your daughter is a pediatric trauma surgeon. She runs the emergency surgical unit at one of the largest children's hospitals in the Midwest. The words landed, and the whole room seemed to tilt. For a second, nobody spoke. Greg looked up from his hands. Castellano set the paper down very carefully. And my mother just stared at me like she was looking at a stranger who happened to be wearing her daughter's face. She's a what? Caroline said. 11 years, Finch went on, reading from the letter now. Medical school, residency, fellowship. She's published. She's been recognized by the State Medical Association. According to this, she spent 2 years with a volunteer surgical program in rural clinics before she took her current position. He set the letter down. I don't usually editorialize at these things, but when someone's character is being put on trial in front of me, the full picture matters. The rain kept tapping the window. My mother kept staring. Greg cleared his throat and didn't say anything, and I sat there feeling the strangest thing, which was not vindication but a kind of grief, because they hadn't known. In 11 years, not one of them had asked. It was my mother who broke the silence. That can't be right, she said. But her voice had gone soft, uncertain. You never told us any of that. I looked at her, and I said the truest thing I knew. You never asked. I watched those 3 words go through her like cold water. She sat back in her chair. Caroline's mouth opened and nothing came out. Greg rubbed the back of his neck. Castellano, to his credit, tried to do his job. Your Honor. Mr. Finch, while Ms. Hartley's career is certainly impressive, it doesn't change the legal question of the will. You're right, Finch said evenly. It doesn't. Service to children doesn't determine inheritance any more than proximity does. He looked over his glasses at my mother. But it does complicate the picture you painted of a selfish girl who only thinks about herself. My mother's face went red. I didn't. That's not what I'm not here to referee what families say to each other, Finch said gently. That's not my job. My job is to read the document. He picked up the will. And the document is not unclear. He read it out. The diner and the land to me, the college money to the grandchildren, the truck to Greg. When he finished, the room stayed silent for a long moment. Caroline found her voice first, and it was smaller than before. Why would Granddad keep that from us? About her job. I answered before Finch could. Because every time my name came up, it turned into a fight. He didn't want that, so he just stopped telling you anything about me. I looked at my mother. He's the only one I told. Because he's the only one who asked. My mother's hands were shaking in her lap. We thought you were ashamed of us, she said. You stopped coming home, and I thought you looked down on us. That whatever you were doing out there, you thought you were too good for Millbrook. And there it was. The fear underneath the anger, the way there always is. She hadn't been protecting the diner. She'd been protecting herself from the daughter she was sure had stopped loving her. I wasn't ashamed of you, I said. My voice cracked, which I hadn't planned on. I stopped coming home because every time I did, you told me I'd thrown my life away. Do you know what it's like to operate on a 4-year-old at 2 a.m. and then drive home and your own mother thinks you're a failure? She didn't answer. She put a hand over her mouth. Finch let the silence stretch, and then he did something I didn't expect. He folded his hands and said quietly, "This was never really about the building, was it?" It wasn't a question. Nobody answered him. He nodded like that was answer enough, and he stacked his papers and the reading was over. That should have felt like winning. It didn't. There's no winning a thing like that. There's just the moment after, when everyone has to figure out how to stand up and walk out of the same room. Caroline and Greg left first, Castellano trailing behind them, his confidence gone somewhere I couldn't see. But my mother stayed in her chair, and so did I. For a while, it was just the 2 of us and the rain. A surgeon, she finally said, to the table more than to me. For children, yeah? She nodded slowly, like she was trying the fact on to see if it fit. Your grandmother always said you had steady hands? A small broken sound came out of her, almost a laugh. I forgot she said that. I didn't say anything. Some silences you have to let breathe. I'm sorry, she said. The words came out one at a time, like each one cost her something. What I said in here, about you being selfish, that wasn't right. You were scared, I said. That doesn't make it okay. No, I agreed. But it makes it human. She looked up at me then. Really looked, the way you look at someone you're meeting again after a long time. I missed 11 years, she said, of your whole life. You did. Can I? She stopped. Started again. Is there a way to not miss the rest of it? I thought about my grandfather, about the note in my pocket, about the diner sitting empty 3 blocks away with my grandmother's recipe still taped inside the cabinet doors. I thought about how he'd been the only one who ever asked, and how he wasn't here to see this, and how badly I wished he was. I'm keeping the diner, I said. I'm going to reopen it. I don't know how yet. I've got a job 4 hours away, but I'm not selling it. He left it to me because he knew I'd understand what it was. My mother nodded. Your grandmother's pie crust recipe is still in the 3rd drawer, she said. If it's still there, she never wrote down the secret. You have to feel it. I know, I said. She showed me when I was 9. That broke something in her gently. Her eyes filled up. She showed you, she repeated. We didn't fix anything in that conference room. You can't fix 11 years in an afternoon, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But when we walked out onto Main Street, the rain had let up, and the air smelled like wet pavement, and the bakery 2 doors down, and my mother asked if I'd want to get a cup of coffee somewhere. Anywhere but the bank. We ended up at the diner. I had the key. I unlocked the door, and the bell rang over our heads, and we stood in the dim quiet of the place where my grandparents had spent their whole lives. I made coffee. Black, no sugar. The way Donna poured it. The way my grandmother taught me. We sat in the booth by the window. The one Mr. taught me. We sat in the booth by the window. Peterson always took, and my mother looked around at the burned-out neon and the worn-down stools and the recipes taped inside the cabinets, and she started to cry. Not the hard kind. Just the kind that comes when you finally set down something heavy. He really was proud of you, she said. Your grandfather, Peterson, told me he carried a newspaper clipping in his wallet. Some award you won. He showed everybody. So that was the clipping. I had to look out the window for a second. Caroline called me 3 days later. It was awkward and short, and neither of us was good at it, but she called. She said the kids would love to meet their aunt the surgeon, and I said I'd love to meet them too, and we both pretended that was a normal thing to say to a sister you'd nearly sued. It's not a fairy tale. We're not suddenly close. There are years between us that no apology fully crosses. But I drove down again the next month, and the one after that. My mother and I started talking on Sunday nights, the way I used to talk to Granddad. Sometimes we run out of things to say, and just sit on the phone in the quiet. That's all right, we're learning. I'm reopening the diner in the spring. I found a manager I trust, and I'll come down on my weekends off. And Donna says she'll come back behind the counter. And the first thing I'm putting on the menu is my grandmother's pie, made from the recipe in the 3rd drawer that you have to feel instead of read. So if you're listening to this and there's somebody in your family you've written off, a sister, a daughter, somebody you decided you already knew everything about, maybe ask them a question before you're sure. You might find out you've been arguing with a stranger you invented. The real person was standing there the whole time, waiting for somebody to finally ask who they were. For years, I told myself the silence between me and my family was peace. Driving away from Millbrook that first time, I really believed I'd done the kind thing by disappearing. But sitting across that conference table from my mother, hearing her call me selfish in front of strangers, I finally understood the truth I'd been avoiding. We hadn't drifted apart by accident. We drifted because nobody in that family ever learned how to ask a question and actually wait for the answer. I think about cause and effect a lot now, the way one small choice rolls into the next. My grandfather chose to keep my career a secret because he wanted to spare me a fight, and that one quiet kindness became the very thing that let my mother build a stranger out of me. Caroline chose to assume I came back for money, because assuming was easier than calling. And I chose, for 3 years, to let the silence stand, because being unseen hurt less than being told I'd failed. Every one of us was protecting ourselves, and every one of us made the distance wider. That's the thing nobody warns you about. The damage in a family is almost never one big betrayal. It's 1,000 small moments where somebody decided not to ask. What saved us, in the end, wasn't the inheritance or even the truth coming out. It was a willingness to do the harder, slower thing. It took a kind of steadiness to sit in that room and not fire back when my mother called me selfish, to let the facts speak instead of my anger. It took clear thinking to bring that letter from the hospital and trust that quiet evidence would carry more weight than shouting ever could. And it took real backbone to keep driving back to Millbrook month after month, to pick up the phone on Sunday nights when it would have been so much easier to vanish again. If there's anything I'd want you to carry from my story, it's this. Be the person in your family who asks first and judges second. Stay honest even when a lie would win you the argument faster. And when something matters, don't run from it just because staying is hard. Rebecca, the girl who left before dessert, thought leaving made her strong. The woman who reopened her grandparents' diner learned that staying and forgiving and showing up again and again takes far more strength than walking away ever did. We didn't get a perfect ending. There are still years between Caroline and me that no apology fully covers. But last spring, my mother stood behind that old counter and watched me make my grandmother's pie, from a recipe you have to feel instead of read, and she cried the good kind of tears. That was enough. Somewhere out there is a person in your life you've already decided you understand completely. Before you're sure, ask them who they really are. You might be surprised who's been standing in front of you the whole time.